Autopilot, this is video number 2. So if you're interested in this topic, I first suggest you to watch video number 1, which shows the general knowledge of the automatic flight director system. Today we are discussing about the lateral navigation function of the autopilot. If you're interested in this topic, follow me into the pilot lab. Today we are at video number 2 concerning lateral navigation. Before I start, I shall remind you that there is a disclaimer to my video, so it's very important that everyone is familiar with what is said in this disclaimer, and that's linked now in the description. And additionally, I shall remind you once again the importance of like and subscribe. Thanks to your like and subscribe, I can keep this channel free of charge. As you know, today there is a lot of commercial interest in making the channel paying. I'm doing every possible effort, keeping this channel free, and your like and subscribe, sharing this video with your friends will greatly help me in succeeding in not having paying contents. So thank you for this, and now let's move to the lateral navigation description. The lateral navigation is, as we say, nothing else than a Sperry autopilot, which is keeping the wings at constant bank angle, and I can couple it to a different parameter. This different parameter could be, for example, the heading, or could be a lateral navigation. Basically, there's not many modes at the end of the day for the lateral navigation. The most basic, the Sperry autopilot, however, has been in time slightly modified. Now, the autopilot disengage of the Airbus corresponds more or less with some little differences, because we said that the parameters that the Airbus can control are definitely larger than the parameters that Boeing can control. So obviously these two modes are different on the two aircraft, but in the logic, in the appearance, I would say, it will definitely look the same, like the control with steering for the 737. On a G1000 aircraft, the autopilot panel does not have a control with steering function. However, it's the Sperry autopilot mode, and this happens by deselecting a specific mode. And now you see that we have roll mode, meaning that we are maintaining constant bank angle. Meaning that if I go back in heading select and I change the selected heading and initiate a turn, and at this point I deselect the mode, you see by being in roll hold, the aircraft is maintaining 28 degrees bank, 25 degrees bank, whatever it is, and it should remain at this bank angle of 25 degrees basically forever. So even if a disturbance is, if I interact a little bit on the flight controls, you see, shouldn't change a lot. I'm inserting a disturbance, and the Sperry autopilot brings back the bank angle back to 25 degrees. So this mode is available. I cannot select the bank angle. I can't say I want to go 15 degrees. You see, if I try, actually what will happen in real life is that most likely the autopilot will disconnect. But even if there is a disturbance, what will happen? Either the autopilot disconnect, either it maintains 25 degrees. If I go back to heading select, of course the aircraft will turn into the selected heading. Same as on the G1000, on the 737, by deselecting a mode, the aircraft entered the control with steering on the specific channel. This time I have a blinking light that advised me the autopilot has no lateral mode, and actually this one is shown with control with steering roll on the primary flight display, leaving empty the flight director, and I lose the flight director. This didn't happen on the Mustang. Of course, as you see now, I'm losing the heading, same as it was on the Mustang. I am continuing the turn with given bank angle. But in this case, I might select a bank angle, so I might turn the aircraft, and for example now I've selected wings level, and the aircraft remains wings level. So by selecting a specific bank angle, for example now I've set 12 degrees, I'm staying at 12 degrees. So that's a Sperry autopilot with a selectable bank angle. There is a little difference therefore. Now if in the selected bank happens to be less than 5 degrees, so you see now I got 8 degrees and I keep 8 degrees, but if I select less than 5,
then the system thinks that I want to go wings level and will automatically roll the aircraft to wings level. Of course, by reselecting a mode, like for example in this case adding select or VR mode, and by reselecting a mode I will regain the vertical bar, and of course the autopilot will be again fully engaged. Another solution is to select intentionally the control with steering, as I'm doing now, and I got control with steering roll, control with steering pitch, and you see that the flight director remains available. So the flight director keeps giving me guidance, but once again I can select the bank angle and fly with the bank angle. You see the flight director is suggesting me to turn 25 degrees bank, so it suggests me to keep turning to the right a bit more bank angle. But again, in the control with steering I can select the roll, in this case the roll and the pitch. So by intentionally select control with steering, I fly the aircraft as if it would be in manual flight, but as a matter of fact the automation remains engaged in the Sperry Autopilot mode with a pilot selectable bank angle and pitch. You see that if I decide, same as with the pitch, if I decide to go select something like, as I did now, 6 degrees in pitch, the aircraft stays still on 6 degrees in pitch. Now on the Airbus it will be physically impossible to disconnect the active mode. In fact, I should click on the heading again and the nav again, but if I click on nav again absolutely nothing happens, it remains on nav. If I pull toward me I go in heading mode, but pulling again heading will not give anything. So basically I can't deselect the specific mode. But as we said, the disconnection of the autopilot will actually cause a pitch hold and a bank hold mode. So you see that if I select a specific bank, the aircraft maintains that specific bank. As we say, the Airbus has many more protections. So for example, if I try to overbank, it will limit me. Let's give a look to the yoke. Okay. Now I'm at 25 degrees steady bank angle, and what happens is that if I try to increase the bank, the aircraft may maintain the new increased bank. So all I do is set in the bank again. It's a Sperry Autopilot with selectable bank. If I select an excessive bank, like for example 45 degrees, okay, now what happens is that you see that the aircraft is rolling back to 33 degrees bank, and that's let's say one of the features of the autopilot. So it will accept an increased bank angle. Sorry, that's me losing the altitude, but it will accept an increased bank angle, as it just did now, 45 degrees. But it will not accept me, as soon as I release the controls, I would say it will roll back to 33 degrees. The very same way, if I increase the bank, if I hold the stick into an increased bank, you see the flight director disappear here, but I won't be able to roll more than 60 degrees. 6 degrees is going to be the absolute maximum, and as soon as I release the controls, again the aircraft goes back to 33 degrees. So even if I want to make, let's say, a 90 degrees turn, I can't, because you see that I reached 60, I have to keep holding, and even by keep holding I can't actually lose the I can't actually exceed the 90 degrees.
Paolo's Pilot Lounge. Like and subscribe now.
Let's first of all discuss on how to read the FMA. I already said, and I can't overemphasize the importance of the fact that the only place where you can confirm the autopilot status is reading the FMA. Reading the FMA is of a vital importance for the pilot. In fact, in time, the FMA has been moved around the flight deck. It used to be some lights on the DC-930 which were just placed, let's say, in the central panel. It then became a specific panel on the MD-80 to finally become part of the T-scan, forming basically a cross-scan, being just on top of the ADI. That's how important the FMA is. is as important as the elements of the T-scan. In fact, I would say that when the autopilot is engaged, the FMA is absolutely as important, enough, if not even more important, because these tell you what is the automation tracking. So if you have a value which is incorrect, the automation will be tracking that value. Therefore, it is a vital information. Now, there is a difference between the 737 and the Airbus flight mode annunciator.
Now, for what concerns the 737, the FMA, of course, as we just said, is on top of the primary flight display. This includes all this area, I would say. The autopilot status of engagement written here just on top of the attitude indicator, meaning that when your eye goes from the attitude indicator to the FMA, you will cross through eventually any yellow flag or any warning, or through the fact that you just have the flight director, not the autopilot engage. And then you will find in this area, this is the speed mode. This area will be the lateral navigation, and that's what we're interested about today. And this is the vertical navigation. So basically, that's all we have to look at talking about the FMA on the 737. Now, if we get the Airbus, we got the same information, but they are distributed in a different way. There you go with the Airbus, you will find autopilot status of engagement is there. So you see that, for example, here the autopilot is not engaged because it will be written here. This is the automation status of engagement. So the flight director, automatic thrust, autopilot engagement, and so on. You'll find here the speed, same as the 737, and then you find the vertical. Now, the reason is the vertical being placed here, so you see that basically those two, vertical and lateral, those two are inverted as compared to the 737. And even if you look at the flight control unit, that they're inverted compared to the sequence of the flight control unit. But the reason for this is that the two elements, vertical and the speed, they're connected together. So being connected together, it was found that it was a better option to put the two one close to the other. And here you will find, for example, additional information. So minimum set, aircraft capability in terms of automatic landing, and other side information that actually are not replicated on the primary flight display for the 737. So just to clarify, that's flight control unit, and that's what I was saying. So we say the FMA of the Airbus will have the speed mode, and you see here you got the speed mode. Then you will have the vertical mode, and you see that the vertical mode is actually in this area. So this will control this column of the vertical mode, and also the lateral mode is crossing, and the lateral mode will be in the third column. So this will be on the FMA, the column of the lateral mode. Not a big deal, but this could put some pilots in difficulty again.
Paolo's Pilot Lounge. Like and subscribe now.
It is very important to understand what is the difference between an armed mode and an active mode. Armed mode are typically shown in white, or on the old autopilot that will be shown in yellow or amber. Okay, these modes, they show you that the mode is not active. The mode will go active when the required item will be satisfied. So an arm mode will have an arm condition, and if that condition is satisfied, then the mode will arm. But the mode will not have any effect on the flight, will not control the autopilot until the mode becomes active. When a mode becomes active, then the active mode is deselected, and the arm mode, which is now active, will control the aircraft. So this is the case, for example, of the altitude. When an altitude is armed, but when you reach the selected altitude, the selected mode will disappear, and the altitude green altitude holding function will activate. Another example could be the VR mode, where you are in heading selected, flying on an heading to intercept a radial. The VOR is armed. Once the VOR is getting into the selected radial, so you see the HSI moving, the function of the VOR is to maintain the HSI centered. It will maintain the HSI centered, the heading select will disengage, and the VOR mode will go green, maintaining the heading. So it's very important to make the difference between an arm mode and an active mode, and it's very important to understand that when a mode is active, it's actually controlling the aircraft. When a mode is armed, it's not controlling the aircraft. It is just waiting for the condition to arise in order to become active, and then once it's active, it will control the aircraft. The altitude mode. Now, it's important to know that the altitude mode is an interesting one, because on the majority of modern aircraft, the altitude is always armed. Now, on the Boeing aircraft, given the fact that the altitude is always armed, the altitude is not shown white on the FMA. But, as just said, the altitude white is virtually always there, because the altitude is always armed. The only case where the altitude is not automatically armed is in the glide slope function, because if the aircraft is following a glide slope, reasonably it's because it's for a landing, and therefore even setting an altitude which is lower than current altitude will not produce a capture of that selected altitude.
Paolo's Pilot Lounge. Like and subscribe now.
Let's start with what is the current situation. We say the only way I can check what's going on is to read the FMA. So don't presume that the autopilot is engaged, or that we are in RTO hold, or that we are in heading select or in speed mode, because these buttons does not mean that we are in that mode. Those buttons only means that this light only means that that mode is deselectable. The only place where I can verify what is the current situation is the flight mode annunciator. So I can see from the flight mode annunciator that the autopilot is in command. We are maintaining the altitude, we are in heading selected and in MCP speed. So the speed selected by the MCP. Now you would say, well, it looks like the same. Yes, but it's not, because for example, if I click on the VOR function, for example, now you have both VOR and heading select which are lighted, but only heading select is active. The VOR is only armed, and I might decide to deselect heading select, as I've done in this moment, and you see that what happens is that I see VOR is green. I would be there thinking that we are in VOR. Actually we're not. We have VOR only armed, and there is no active mode, and this lack of active mode is confirmed by the fact that I have a caution message by the autopilot. The autopilot is blinking. I get the control with steering, but again, if I acknowledge the message of the autopilot, basically now the only reminder is the control with steering. So the correct thing to do, of course, is always look at the FMA to determine where we are. Now we are in heading select, and maintaining the altitude with altitude hold MCP speed. Box in the heading select, reminding us that it's the last mode selected. Good, let's first of all give a look to the lateral mode. So the lateral modes, we have it listed here. We are looking at the heading select, we are looking the VOR and the LNAV. So that's what we're looking at for the lateral mode. Approach is a combined mode. Being a combined mode, it will contain also the lateral, so the VOR function.
Let's now move to the heading, which might look like simple, but it's not always that simple.
So on a G1000, of course, the function heading select will allow the autopilot to follow the heading. There's no secret there. You see I'm turning the heading knob, and the aircraft is following the new heading. A little bit of our bank here. That's a problem of Flight Simulator. In reality, the aircraft won't bank that much. You see that in this case, well, we have an example of an autopilot which is a bit too aggressive, so it's lacking in stability, but of course is very reactive, so as soon as I make a heading change, the aircraft will turn with a very high bank. Okay, in all cases, all autopilots, they have the possibility to reduce the bank. So for example, if I have an engine failure, or if I'm flying at high altitude and don't want to bank that much, on this specific autopilot I have the selection of bank. With this you get half of the bank. You normally get displayed a 1/2 bank. In this case, this flight simulator is not reproducing. On the G1000 you should normally get it, the 1/2 bank displayed. And once you have this 1/2 bank display, you see when I select a new heading, we're now turning with 15 degrees bank. As I said, normally used for high altitude flying or single engine situation where you want to make a smooth maneuvering. Now, what happens if I turn more than 180 degrees? The G1000, well, it's a software thing, so it's very easy to change. You have to check on your aircraft, but normally what happens is that by turning them more than 180 degrees, the aircraft will actually turn the shortest way. So you see that at the moment we're still turning to the right, and as soon as I pass 180 degrees, there we go, the aircraft is now turning to the left, because I have how can I say, I have exceeded 180 degrees, so we're now turning to the left. So that's a logic of the aircraft, and nothing special there, I would say. Okay, let's go back to the normal bank. One thing I didn't say is that on this autopilot you can click on the heading, and by clicking in the heading you synchronize the heading. So if the ATC asks you maintain present heading, you just have to click on the heading and the heading will be centered on the present heading. That's an additional function, could be useful.
Now, before we move to any other more complex system, we have to describe what is the engagement and what is the maintaining phase of the autopilot. Because every mode, when you engage that mode, it's not said, actually it's not even said that it will engage. In some cases, you might press a button and the mode won't engage because the rules of engagement are not satisfied. It could be that you press that button and the mode just arm. This is, for example, for the Vorlock, or in some cases for the navigation. Or it could be like it is for heading select, that as soon as you press the heading select command, the aircraft goes in heading select. But still, when you do it, there is an engagement phase where the aircraft initially have to adapt to the new command, start following the heading, and then there is a maintaining phase where the aircraft is actually maintaining the selected heading. So we will look at the scheme, taking into account what is the slaved loop, what is the autopilot slave to, what are the logic of slaving at the moment of the engagement of the autopilot, and later on when the autopilot is already engaged and stable on that slaved parameter.
Now, you remember we spoke about the outer loop for the stability and controllability. Let's review what will be, from the software point of view, so from a computer, what will be the logic that the autopilot has to follow for those two loops. Okay, so the outer loop is obviously maintaining the heading selected. That's the target of the outer loop. The target of the inner loop is to limit the bank angle so as not to exceed the bank angle limit. The phase of this function will be initially to determine what is the shortest direction to reach the selected heading, so to determine whether we have to turn left or right. The capture phase, so once the initial part has been achieved, we are turning to the new heading. The capture phase will be the start of the rolling with the wings level in order to end up on the wing level on the selected heading. And of course the tracking phase, once we are on the selected heading, the tracking phase will be keep rolling wings left or right in order to maintain the selected heading. And this logic will be applicable to all aircraft, including the Boeing that we will see next. So heading select, well, this mode is very simple. Heading select, I select an heading and the aircraft follows the heading. So I would say it's pretty distinctive, isn't it? I selected the heading. As you can see, the aircraft is now turning to the new heading. Now the heading select is the only mode where I can manually select the bank angle. So I can choose how many degrees I want. So The heading select, for example, if I go on the outer knob and I select 30 degrees bank, when I select the turn, as I'm doing now, the aircraft is turning with 30 degrees. Fair enough. Let's just wait until the turn is engaged, so you will see that we're gonna go to 30 degrees. It takes a little while, but here we go 30 degrees. Okay, and now other option is that I can change the bank angle. For example, I can go 15 degrees. When I go 15 degrees, the bank reduced to 15 degrees, as you're seeing. Now it's gonna actually stabilizing on the heading, so I should turn to a new heading. But on the new heading, you will see it will take a 15 degrees bank angle turn.
Changing the bank angle limit will not only change, of course, the maximum bank of the aircraft, but as I said, will change the roll rate of the aircraft. This means that if, for example, for rolling from wings level to 30 degrees bank, it might take maybe 20 seconds, no more than that, okay, maybe 15 seconds, something like that. Now, if you select 15 degrees bank, to roll from wings level to 15 degrees bank, it should take half of the time. So if it was 20 seconds, now it should take 10 seconds. This is not true. When you select a bank angle which is less, the roll rate will also reduce. Meaning that if you have 30 degrees bank selected and it takes 20 seconds to reach 30 degrees bank, when you select 15 degrees, it will still take maybe 20 seconds. Maybe here I'm exaggerating with times, it will still be a slower bank change. What does this mean in practical words? Well, it doesn't really have a strong effect, but you have to be cautious, because say that you are selecting a turn by 30 degrees to the left or to the right, okay? And you do it when you have a bank angle selector of 30 degrees. Now the aircraft banks with a fairly high roll rate to 30 degrees. Now you realize that 30 degrees bank angle is a bit too much for passenger comfort, or maybe because you're at high altitude, you don't want to reduce that much the stall margin, because when you increase the bank angle, of course, you reduce the stall margin. So it could be that you decide, you know what, I'm gonna select 10 degrees bank angle, okay? By doing so, by selecting 10 degrees bank angle, what will happen is that you reduce the roll rate of the autopilot. So the autopilot, yes, will roll from 30 degrees to 10 degrees and will continue the turn with 10 degrees bank angle. But if you do so when you are, for example, some 15 or 10 degrees from the end of the turn, actually this will cause your autopilot to overshoot the turn. Because with a reduced bank angle, you actually increase the stability of the autopilot on the roll control. And a more stable autopilot will do nothing else than being very slow in the bank angle correction. So the autopilot will be extremely stable, extremely slow in correcting the bank angle. The bank angle will slowly reduce from 30 to 10, but then the autopilot realizes that the heading has been already overshoot, so will all continue to reduce to 0 and eventually turn the opposite way. So yes, changing the bank angle where you're very close to the end of the turn will cause potentially an overshoot of the selected heading.
Now the bank angle, the heading select, will memorize the direction of the turn on the 737. So you see that I'm turning to the right, and even if I turned more than 180 degrees and the shortest way will be turning to the left, this aircraft is actually turning to the right, so it's memorizing the direction of the turn. Actually, this is an option, so many aircraft, like for example the MD-80, will just turn the shortest way. So it's a very basic autopilot and it will take the shortest way. Other aircraft, like the 737, will turn on the direction of the turn. However, this happens only if the heading mode is already selected. So let's take an example. Let's center the HSI, and we will discuss the VR mode in a moment, but let's center the HSI for the moment, just for the purpose of taking a different mode, like for example Vorlock. Here we go. I go in Vorlock. Vorlock is arm at the moment, Vorlock is green, the heading is deselected, and what I do once we are in navigation, normally keep the heading centered, okay? And now what happens is that I decide to turn to the right on heading 150. And you see that what I do is that I take the heading, I turn the heading all the way to the right, onto the heading 150, which is the desired one, and I've turned to the right, so the aircraft should be turning to the right. But when I click heading select, what happens is that the aircraft is going to turn to the left, is going to turn the shortest way. So what makes the difference between turning left or turning right? Sorry, heading I have a lock again, so we follow the navigation. But I was saying, what makes the difference between turning left or turning right? Well, as I said, is the fact that you selected heading select before or after. So I centered the heading again, and what happens is that if I want to turn right heading 150, I first have to go heading select. Once I'm heading select, I'll turn all the way to the right 150, and now the aircraft will turn to the right. Okay, so you have the option whether you want to turn the shortest way, whether you want to turn on the same direction of the turn, and this option is made by the fact that you press heading select before or after turning the knob. And yes, it's an easy mode at the end, but make sure you don't fall in any trap using this mode. Let's give a look on the Airbus instead. How does the heading select work? Now, once you are in the nav mode, as we are navigating with the FMS, the heading bag disappears, but if I turn the knob, the heading bag appears again, and I can select whatever heading I wish, of course. Now, if you pull towards you, the aircraft will start turning onto the selected heading. There is no facility here to select the bank angle, that it will be automatically managed again by the FMS. Now, I'm turning the heading of more than 180 degrees. What would happen in some aircraft like MD-80 or older generation of aircraft? The aircraft would turn the shortest way. This is not happening. Of course, the Airbus keep turning in the direction in which I have turned the heading. So if I wish to turn to the left, what I have to do is to turn, of course, on the opposite side. When I turn on the opposite side, of course, I take the left turn. Okay. Now, it could be that, again, I click down the button. When I push down the button, I arm the navigation mode, and this is shown on the flight control unit with the dot. But what is important, once again, is that I am checking what is on the flight mode annunciator. So I shouldn't look at the dot here, though this one is an important cue, but what I should look at is the heading and the nav blue, which means that the nav is armed. Okay. If I go in nav, I can see what was the previously selected route. Actually, the arc mode in this case will be better. Maybe I can select a better range. There we go, and you can see that actually it's showing me that present heading is actually working well. The heading is still active, as the FMA can tell me, because the fact that the heading is active can be seen by the heading green, nav blue. So that's where I'm looking at to determine the heading is still active. So if I want, what I can do is that I can change the heading, and of course, as long as I'm intercepting, the intercept will be recalculated by the system. There we go, I have re-intercepted the program route, and we're back to nav. Of course, if I would give a direct on the FMS, I would go direct into the nav function without this heading and nav armed logic. Now let's give a look what happens if actually I want to make a right turn. So once again, I'll change the mode to VOR, and in the wish of making a right turn, I start turning the heading, obviously to the right, but I turn to the heading in the right more than 180 degrees, and once this is done, then I pull toward me the heading selecting. Now we are in heading green, and what happens is that the aircraft is actually turning on the same direction on which I've turned the heading. So unlike the 737, the Airbus is actually keeping and memorizing what is the direction in which I have turned the heading, and the aircraft will always turn in that direction and not in the shorter way. So there are some differences here. One last thing we can say about the Airbus heading mode is that if I select a turn, there we go, now I'm selecting I turn to the left, okay? Then the heading remains displayed, and this causes a thread because basically I could forget the fact that I have turned the knob to the left rather than to the right. And as time goes by, maybe I then realize after a few seconds that I have selected the heading and I'm not turning, and maybe I meant to turn to the right. And now if I actually pull toward me, I'm gonna go in heading select, but the aircraft, as we said, memorizes the direction of turn and turns to the left rather than to the right. Now, for this reason, the manufacturer recognized that there is this thread, and for example, let's pretend that the ATC tell me after 2V point, which is the next point, turn left heading 240. What I would do is that I would pre-select to the left, long way around heading 240. But let's start the timer and let's see for how long it stays. Okay, it should be more or less 40 seconds, and after that the heading will disappear, of course without touching the heading selector. If I select an heading, then the heading will stay displayed for another further 40 seconds, which means that basically by the time I reach 2VIP, it could be that the heading knob has disappeared and now I forgot what was the heading. So pre-selecting an heading and waiting for a point in order to click or to pull towards you the heading selector is not a good idea, because this should disappear now. There we go, 40 seconds, the heading selected has disappeared, and eventually now I can't remember what was the direction of turn. It remains the fact that for as long as the heading remains displayed, the aircraft will memorize the direction of turn. So let's do a last turn. Once again, I'm selecting to the left, heading 240. I start the timer. There we are, we're approaching 35 seconds, and I pull toward me, and now you see once again the aircraft has memorized the direction of turn, so we're turning to the left. So for as long as the heading is displayed, the aircraft will turn in the same direction. But after approximately 40 seconds, the heading selected will display. It's not a good idea if the air traffic control authorizes you to reach a point and then turn to an heading. It's not a good idea to pre-select the heading, as it is instead done on many other aircraft models.
Welcome to Aviomar Flight Academy, a selected training partner of Ryanair for the provision of highly qualified and skilled pilots to the airline. Our industry-leading APS MCC course has been developed to provide future Ryanair pilots with the skills and competencies as required by the airline to commence the type rating on the Boeing 737-800 aircraft.
You will acquire competence to work in multi-crew environment, practicing task and CRM exercises. Unlike a standard MCC course, you will become competent in managing sequences of actions, and more complicated systems are presented on a line aircraft. Ultimately, only in the Ryanair APS MCC the focus will be on the skills and competence required to meet the company standards and successfully complete the subsequent type rating and line training.
Our training is conducted by instructors with direct Ryanair operational experience.
The standard of the simulator used in our Ryanair APS MCC course is specified to support that the training provided represents the real airline standard aircraft. The course is structured in a way to address areas where pilot can be weak during an airline assessment and to easily adapt to a modern airline working environment.
The extra emphasis on the core competencies, manual handling, airline standard simulators, and instructors will provide students with outstanding preparation for their upcoming assessment. Students will be exposed to Ryanair's safety culture and operational philosophy from day one of the program, in addition to having an exclusive access to a fast-track recruitment process. Program graduates will enjoy a distinctive advantage at the actual interview and assessment stage. Why choose a standard MCC course when you can have so much more? It will be our pleasure to welcome you at Aviomar Flight Academy in Rome.
Paolo's Pilot Lounge. Like and subscribe now.
Let's move now to the nav or the VOR lock mode. This mode is connected to the HSI and is intended for the use of keeping VOR radial or keeping a localizer centered. Now, it works through the HSI, and therefore, being coupled to the HSI, this function actually maintains a course. The Airbus does not have this function available, and it's only applicable to the localizer of an ILS. We can see that the slaving parameter is the CDI, the course deflection indicator, or the needle of the HSI, in few words. The outer loop has the job of keeping the CDI centered. The inlet loop, or the stability loop, has the job of limiting the bank angle to 30 degrees. Now, the initial phase, so when you press VOR, most likely the system will arm, meaning that if you're not with the CDI centered, the system will just not engage but will remain armed until the initial phase is satisfied. So the initial phase is measuring how fast is the CDI centering. So if the CDI is not moving and is fully deflected, the mode will remain armed. But once the CDI is moving, then the mode will engage based on this rate of centering of the CDI. Just the speed, how fast does the CDI center. The capture phase will start rolling the aircraft onto a track which is similar to the selected course in order to center the CDI. And the tracking mode will have the function of rolling left and right in order to keep the CDI center. So you see that it will correct for the wind, but just looking at the CDI, the system doesn't even know which heading are we flying. Okay, all the calculations are based on the course deviation indicator. Let's now give a look to the VOR lock function. Now, the VOR lock function has the function of keeping the HSI centered. So all we do by looking at the HSI is looking at this bar. The VOR lock function looks how fast this bar center, and once the bar is centered, its job is to turn right if the bar is to the right, left if the left is the bar is to the left. So it's all it does. Well, let's cancel this drawing and let's arm the VOR lock. Let's see what happened. Now, the VOR lock has an arm function. The arm function means that the system is not active. The system will activate once the CDI, the course deviation indicator, this is the CDI. Once the CDI starts moving, the VOR lock will calculate how long does it take for the CDI to move, and will therefore calculate when it is time to turn in order to intercept. Now, the intercept using VOR lock is recommended to be at approximately 30 degrees. Now, we find ourselves more or less 90 degrees, so the needle is going to move fast, and it's not say that the VOR lock is going to be able to keep the CDI center. If the CDI moves too fast, then the VOR lock won't be able to intercept. Alright, there we are. The needle is started to move, and because the VOR lock sensed the move fairly fast, the VOR lock engaged straight away. The VOR lock is green, the previous heading select is completely lost. The aircraft is now turning in order to intercept this radial. As I said before, it's not say that it will intercept. If I try to intercept with a too high angle at a too close distance, so the factors are two, it's the distance and the intercept angle. If I try to intercept at a too high angle, at a too short distance, then what happens is that the needle moves too fast and I'm not going to be able to track it. You see, I overshoot a little bit, but I would say that's acceptable. So now the Warlock is keeping the needle centered, and you see that it will take whatever maneuvering is needed to keep this needle center, including the correction of the wind. At the moment I have strong crosswind from the left side, and the Warlock will maintain the navigation, will maintain the wind correction angle that is needed to navigate and fly to the station. Now, as we are approaching the station, we should wonder what will happen once we overfly the VOR, because the best technique is to match the heading as I'm doing now and go heading select so that the aircraft maintains the heading. We continue on the so-called dead reckoning once we cross over the VOR. Obviously, crossing over the VOR, we're gonna lose the VOR signal, there's gonna be fluctuation of the CDI, and the autopilot could have even abrupt movements or abrupt correction in the attempt of correcting the fast movement of the CDI. Now, to protect the aircraft from overbanking or to make too much abrupt movements, what happens is that some autopilot will have an automatic dead reckoning function. So when the CDI start fluctuating too much, the aircraft just stay on the heading. So this depends on the type of the aircraft, on the model, and sometimes on the options as well. So my recommendation is that is best practice, once you overfly the VOR, you go heading select, and that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to go just heading select. You go heading select so that this sort out the problem. Over the VOR, the signal is going to fluctuate because we are in the cone of confusion of the VOR, but the autopilot is not going to go crazy in attempting to follow a signal which is fluctuating, which is false signal, because we are in the so-called cone of confusion. Now you see, as I'm approaching the station, I lost a little bit the navigation. I am 1 mile, but considering this land distance, basically I'm over the station. There we go, the signal has been lost. I'm overflying the station now, and now I find myself outbound. As I find myself outbound again, I can make a little correction on the heading required if needed. I would say it's not even needed, but if needed, the wind drifted me a little bit to the right, so I can turn a bit more to the left, and I can rearm Warlock again. Now, because we're very close to the station, obviously the radio is going to move very fast, so a couple of degrees was more than enough to get the Warlock armed. Now the Warlock is armed, and again the Warlock is going to do the job of keeping the needle centered and navigating. So, easy job. Now, one thing I have to pay attention to is when I use Warlock is, well, it's a number of things we have to think about. Now, one of the main thing we have to think about, which HSI is master, and that's an important piece of information, I would say. Why this? Because you see that we have 2 master lights on the flight director, but only one is lighted at the time. So master at the moment is the first officer and the captain is off, meaning that the right autopilot is in service and is following the right HSI. So the HSI which is commanding the autopilot is the right one. So for example, if I go on the left side and select a course on the left side, and the course would call, as this in this example, for a flight to the left, you see that of course the autopilot is following the first officer side. Now if I go master on the captain side, there we go, with master on the captain side, now the Warlock coupled on the captain side, and you see that we now start following the HSI of the captain. Now again, you have to use caution, because sometimes, for example, you are doing the briefing and you are navigating on a radial, so you have to think about, okay, which HSI can I use to prepare or to set for the course of the approach, and which HSI should I keep on the current navigation because it's what is needed for the autopilot. Now, because you changed over controls, what happens is very often, say to the pilot monitoring, which now is pilot flying, you tell him, okay, just use your HSI for navigation and I set up on my side for the approach. Yes, but pay attention, because if your autopilot remained master, then it's a problem, because the autopilot is going to follow your HSI and not the captain HSI, as we're doing now. Now, some companies, as the SOP, that when they hand over control, they also hand over the autopilot, so they change the autopilot side. In this way, you don't have this problem, so you can set the approach on your side and use the HSI of the pilot monitoring, which became pilot flying for the briefing, use his HSI for the navigation. Okay, so pay attention to this difference. Now, another hidden thread, I would say, or another difficulty you might have, is that sometimes go back to the navigation on the first officer side. Sometimes what happens is that you have to make an adjustment, so maybe you have to change the course. As you change the course, you don't think about it, but you're still in Vorlock. So let's see, that's what I'm going to do now, and change the course, you see, and the Vorlock is going to start turning to the right. Now the Vorlock, after a while, will disengage. So if I turn too much, we go full scale, now the autopilot start turning a lot because he wants to bring the HSI back to the center. Does not understand that it's me turning, okay? So you see that now probably I selected the course for the next route, and what very often happens is that the Vorlock disengages. And with the disengagement of the Vorlock, you see we went in control with steering now, so we lost the lateral mode. Of course, I got the warning from the autopilot telling me that we are in control with steering role, and here I have to select another mode. So make sure that when you change the course, you're not in the Vorlock function, because of course the Vorlock has the function of selecting the course. So in this case, probably gonna go heading select to sort out the problem, and with the heading select, we are following the heading, and now I have to give an heading to either intercept the new radial, and of course we'll follow the new radial. I would say for the Vorlock is about this, so there's no many secrets, just some attentions that you have to pay with the pilot flying, pilot monitoring, with the selection of courses and so on, but it's minor stuff. Normally a proficient pilot shouldn't have too many problems with this. Let's move to the G1000. Good, in this case I have set of course, and if I go nav, by arming nav, you see actually the VOR in this case is captured straight away. The VOR modes will track the radial always in the direction of the course. So now here we have to recall one of the knowledges of the basic AFR, reminding you that the autopilot will always intercept in the direction of the selected course. So because the course was 277 in this specific case, the autopilot will intercept the navigation in the direction on the course 277. So here the autopilot started the turn and then realized was turning a bit early, and now will complete the interception and the correction. So of course if there is any wind, then the wind will be corrected automatically with the VOR tracking function. Alright, in this further example, arming the VOR. So you see the VOR is white, as we said. An armed mode has nothing to do with what the autopilot is actively doing. So the autopilot has nothing to do with the VOR mode, okay? The VOR mode is armed when the condition will be satisfied. So if this current heading will eventually bring me onto the selected course, then the autopilot will intercept. It means that the heading will disappear and the VOR will become green. So that's the important message to get here, is that the VOR is armed, mean the absolutely no effect on the flight until it goes green. An arm mode has no effect on the glide on the flight, but leaving an arm mode, for example, is a threat if you don't want to intercept that route. For example, let's say that now the ATC says, okay, cancel the previous clearance and continue on the heading. Now see, we are continuing on the heading, but leaving VOR armed, obviously it's a threat, because once I reach that specific radial, the aircraft will intercept. There we are. We actually, to me, it looks a bit too early, but 8 degrees before the VOR became green, meaning that the aircraft is now capable of intercepting. In fact, it's not turning, so in my opinion, as compared to the real aircraft, this VR engagement is a bit early. Well, you see that we even turned by maybe 2 or 3 degrees on the left, which is the wrong side, I would say. But in all cases, now the radial is approaching. I would say in the real aircraft the VR would go green more or less in this position, where the aircraft should now start initiating the right turn to start tracking the radial. Let's see if we actually start turning. There we go. We actually start turning now. So we're gonna be tracking the radial, and the autopilot will be indeed correcting for the crosswind condition as well. Here I get the wind components as well. So you see we got very little crosswind, so all the wind is headwind, and now we have intercepted the radial and we are flying direct to the station. Again, it's good practice to keep the heading centered, so I could click on the heading button, make the heading centered. Otherwise, if the ATC called me saying maintain present heading, I just have to click on the heading before clicking heading select. Not a problem on this aircraft. Now, what happens if I, by mistake, or accidentally or by distraction, I move the HSI? Now, that's a problem, because if the only function of the autopilot is to track the selected course. So if I change the course by few degrees, you see, as soon as I change the course, the aircraft start, and eventually even in an aggressive way, start tracking the new selected course. Now, I just selected the course by 1 degree, which in this case is not a problem, but say that I change the course by a few degrees, this could cause a little bit of problems and eventually even the disconnection of the autopilot. So, sorry, not the autopilot, of the mode. So you see that now the VR is going a bit crazy because of this. There we go. The VR mode has disconnected, and when the VR mode disconnects, we get back to the basic mode, which is the roll. So now the aircraft went back to the Sperry autopilot in the roll mode, which is not what I want. So of course at this point I have to monitor the automation and probably engage heading. So very often it happens that the pilot accidentally or by mistake, without thinking, just select a new course, maybe because the next step is the approach, and once you select the new course, of course the autopilot starts going crazy in the attempt of selecting the new selected course. In conclusion, we have seen the logic of HSI number 1, HSI number 2, the master left or right, or the transfer for the G1000. The logic of functioning of both G1000 and 737 remains identical. So the two systems might be used exactly in the same way. Now let's move to the Airbus, where the VOR function does not exist, but the localizer function is used exclusively for the localizer use. Now the lock function is available only on the localizer, which I'm passing now, so I'll turn a bit more to the left now in order to be able to re-intercept the localizer, of course. And the localizer function is exactly the same function of the VOR lock on the 737. So I have to arm it, as I'm doing now. Once this is armed, of course, the function of the VOR lock is going to be to keep the CDI centered. So the CDI again is the magenta bar, the bar that tell me what is the course deviation. But this one is available only, as I just said, it is available only in the ILS function, not in the VOR function for the Airbus. So now with the lock arm, of course, we will intercept the localizer. But as a matter of fact, I'm getting on the glide. Now, because I want to intercept the localizer only, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to select a lower altitude, and I'm going to start descending using vertical speed. And actually I'm a bit high there, so probably never gonna be able for the ILS. I'm still in clean configuration, but there we go. Lock is green, so that's what I wanted to say, is that you see that with this we are intercepting the localizer. The aircraft is automatically tracking the CDI and will take the heading left or right as needed to maintain the navigation. Now, there is a last autopilot function that we have to describe, and this is the BC back course function. You see, I'm flying on the heading, I select back course, and the aircraft actually track the HSI. So it will look like nothing new, but the particular thing is that I'm tracking the HSI on the other way around. This is the only function that allow you to track the HSI in the opposite direction, not in the direction of the selected course, but on the direction which is opposite to the selected course. Why this? Well, this is actually, we should get into the radio navigation LNAV theory to explain the problem, but this is because while on the VOR we're just comparing a phase, and the deviation bar of the HSI, so the CDI, is just depending on the phase difference as received by the VOR. On the localizer we're just comparing two different frequencies, and the localizer bar will move left or right based on the differences of those two frequencies. So if you wish to fly a localizer signal in the opposite direction, the so-called back course flying, you have no option, or there is no automatic function that will allow you to do that, because the localizer can only track in one direction. Changing the direction of the HSI will not change the deflection of the bar of the CDI as it would change if you would use the VOR. For this reason, the back course function allow you exclusively on a localizer signal, allow you to track in the opposite direction. Now what I want to show you here, that you see how I have set an heading to intercept, and I have armed the localizer. This heading is absolutely inadequate. Normally a localizer should be intercepted with no more than 30 degrees angle of intercept. Here I have something like 120 degrees angle of intercept. You see that despite this massive angle, when the localizer becomes green, I still start turning in the good direction, in the correct direction of the HSI. So this is the function localizer for the ILS, and of course the VOR function will do exactly the same thing, because that's the normal use of the HSI for both ILSs and VOR. In this case, instead, I have armed the back course function, and my heading to intercept the ILS, well, still would be a bit high, 45 degrees, with the front course of the localizer. But again, I have armed the BC back course. It means that this function, as we just said, will turn exclusively using a localizer frequency, will turn on the opposite direction of the HSI. So we'll keep the bar centered, yes, but flying the opposite course. So you see that now that we will capture the back course, or anyway, now that we will capture the HSI, the aircraft will start turning to the left, flying the opposite direction, the back course. On the 737, the back course button does not exist, so you won't find a BC button, but this function is covered with the VOR lock function, so you have to press the VOR lock. So the question becomes, well, how does the aircraft knows that we have to follow the front course or the back course? Well, the answer is by looking at the intercept angle. Unfortunately, I could not replicate the real behavior of the aircraft on my home simulator. In fact, I armed the VOR lock function, and when I intercepted the localizer in order to fly the back course, the aircraft actually turned in the wrong direction, attempting to intercept the front course. This automatic function of intercepting back course instead of front course is found on the 737 with the so-called correct sensing. You will see that it is a typical habit of 737 pilots to call correct sensing prior arming the localizer. What does this correct sensing mean? Well, in this flight simulator it is actually not replicated. You see that the CDI bar is actually calling me a flight to the right. If I would be on the front course, I should fly to the right. Now actually for the back course I have to fly to the left, and you see that on the primary flight display the white diamond representing the localizer of the ILS, it called me a flight to the right, consistent to a front course flying and not a back course flying. Let's instead take into analysis this video recorded on a 737 simulator where the aircraft intercept with less or more than 90 degrees the selected course, and you see that for the same situation with the deviation bar showing a flight to the right, the primary flight display actually shows the diamond either to the left, either to the right, and this reversing shown left or right depends on the fact that the aircraft is intercepting with less or more than 90 degrees. Thus, the call correct sensing, meaning that the video on the left, the aircraft will intercept the front course, making a left turn in few words, and the video on the right, the aircraft will intercept the back course, making a right turn. On the Airbus, the behavior that you're seeing replicated by my home flight simulator is actually corresponding to the real behavior of the aircraft, where the back course function does not exist and there is no reversal of the indication, therefore the aircraft is unable to capture a back course. The only way to fly a back course approach is normally using a track flight path angle and of course setting the correct front course and the rose mode for the navigation during final approach.
Paolo's Pilot Lounge. Like and subscribe now.
Let's talk now about the LNAV. Now the LNAV required the uses of the FMS, which goes a bit beyond, let's say, the scope of this presentation. But I changed it now with the plan mode. I can select a point on the FMS, execute, and you see I have a magenta line. Now the aircraft is not following the magenta line because we are in heading select. If I go LNAV, of course we're going LNAV, and now the aircraft is following the magenta line. Again, good practice is that I keep the heading center, so I could anticipate the fact that we're turning more or less 90 degrees to right, and I could set an heading which is more or less 90 degrees to right in order to be able to go heading select in case I need to go for a dead reckoning or I need to maintain the heading because the FMS have lost the route. The lateral navigation is not affected by the selected bank angle, so you see that if I go direct to 2VIP, I'm selecting direct to 2VIP on the FMS, executing this, the aircraft is not turning. I have to manually select the LNAV, so even if I execute a route I have to manually select the LNAV. Now the autopilot is finally coupled to the FMS and I'm using the actually highest level of automation. You also see that there's been a time frame between the moment I selected 2VID and the time I selected LNAV. So you see that actually turning with a steeper rate of turn than what it was initially calculated by the FMS. All the autopilot does when LNAV is engaged is following the magenta line, meaning that if the magenta line is to the right, the aircraft will turn to right. If the magenta line is to the left, the aircraft will turn to left. So all the autopilot does is more or less the same idea of tracking the CDI on the VOR, so turning left or right in order to keep the CDI center. Here we're turning left or right in order to keep the magenta line centered. So you see that now we have reduced the bank angle to 10 degrees because we are approaching the magenta line and the autopilot sees that there is a quick recovery of the distance from the magenta line, so the bank angle has been reduced in order to maintain the track of the magenta line. Now if I'm on heading and I will try to engage the LNAV, what will happen is that the LNAV will not engage. Now on this simulator I don't get any full message from the FMS, but normally I should get a full message from the FMS saying you're not on the intercept route. In fact, if I center and look for where is the magenta line, I discover that the magenta line is fairly far away from me on the left side and the current track is not bringing me onto an intercept heading. If instead I take an intercept heading, like I will be doing now, now on this new intercept heading, if I arm LNAV, the LNAV should engage. There we go. Actually it will engage straight away and maintain the present track, not the present heading actually, but the present track, to intercept the magenta line. Obviously, I can always avoid this by selecting a direct. So if I refresh the direct, I recalculate the route direct to the point. There we go. And now the LNAV is actually flying direct to the point. What I was doing before was re-intercepting the previous route, or a route which was not starting from my present position. Let's give a look therefore to what are the logic of functioning of the autopilot in the LNAV function. So you see that the outer loop is tracking the magenta line. The only tracked number is the distance from the magenta line. The game is keeping this distance to 0, keep the aircraft on the magenta line. The inner loop, the stability loop, will make sure that the aircraft does not exceed the bank angle of 30 degrees. And for the initial and capture phase, well, here it says not applicable. This is not totally correct. There are some logic that the flight control computer will follow if the aircraft actually is not perfectly on the magenta line at the beginning of the navigation. But it is absolutely true that when I pressed LNAV and I was not on the magenta line, the aircraft recalculated the magenta line to get onto the original LNAV route. And so basically the whole function is going to be a tracking function, so keep rolling left to right in order to keep the distance from the magenta line equal 0 nautical miles. For what concerns the navigation on the GPS, on the G1000 it is sufficient to use the nav function. The autopilot will automatically understand that the HSI has been set on a GPS route, and when I click nav, instead of getting the VR mode, I will get the GPS mode directly. It's also interesting to note that on the HSI I get also the precision of navigation, which is terminal, meaning that the deflection of the HSI corresponds to the terminal precision of 2 nautical miles. So, for what concerns the CDI, I might decide to switch the CDI to the VOR, but by switching to the VOR, I will cause a mode deselection. So then I can arm again, of course, nav, and in this case, it's gonna be the VOR armed, okay? Of course, if I don't want to arm the VOR, I will deselect again the VOR by clicking on the nav function. So the selection of the GPS or all the other functions like the approach mode will be through the button nav or through the button approach, depending on the type of the navigation for the navigation or approach navigation that I want to follow. Alright, let's give a look on the Airbus what happens if I insert a direct routing. So if I go on the direct, I get all the points of the flight plan, and of course I can insert a specific waypoint. I will select a point which is fairly behind me, and you see that I have a number insert that asks me if I want to execute. If I execute being the point behind me, the aircraft will automatically turn into the nav mode and start following the calculated route, so the green line. Now, what is the bank angle based on what? You see that now we are turning with more or less 25 degrees bank angle. This bank angle is calculated by the FMS, obviously, based on the performance of the aircraft. Currently, I am in the mode expedite climb, which means basically just reducing to the maximum speed and get the best climb rate that the aircraft can give me in the present situation. And this brings us pretty close to the stall limit, as you can see. And what happens is that the bank angle is being adapted so as not to bring the aircraft into less than 1.3 the velocity of stall. So all of this is being calculated by the FMS. Obviously this can be done only by the FMGS of the Airbus, because the guidance system is part of the FMS. If you would take a Boeing 737, the lateral navigation wouldn't be able to take account onto the actual performance of the aircraft in terms of vertical speed. So of course the FMS of the 737 will take account of the performance of the aircraft, so will limit the bank angle the very same way, but this calculation is made on database information and not on actual sensed information by the specific autopilot channel of the LNAV in the case of the 737 and nav in the case of the Airbus. You see, the very same way I will introduce the direct to a point which is just behind us. There we go, and I'll go insert. So, is the aircraft gonna bank with 30 degrees bank, given the fact that we are in the expedite climb mode, so very close to the 1.3s. Basically we reduce at maximum the speed in order to have the highest rate of climb. We are at high altitude, level 340, climbing level 380, and you see that the aircraft is turning with 10 degrees of bank. Actually now we even have 9 degrees of bank, so this turn is extremely low, and this is given the fact that we are flying at a very low speed close to the stall, and so we don't want to reduce the stall margin, and for this reason the FMS calculate the turn with a reduced turn. And now you see that factually, despite the fact that actually the altitude has increased, but yes, we have a bit more margin from the stall speed at this speed, and the FMGS realizes that we might increase a bit more the bank angle, and you see that factually we are turning at 15 degrees bank. This shows the fact that the FMS is adapting the bank angle to the current performance of the aircraft, not just database or theoretical numbers, but current performance of the aircraft based on, you know, what the aircraft is doing. The very same way, if I say, yeah, I want to turn faster, okay, I can take the heading and select an heading to the left, okay, and pull toward me the heading selector, so of course now it's turning faster. You see that despite I'm turning, yes, faster, the bank angle is no more than 20 degrees, because, once again, I'm reaching very high altitude. Same thing, but this time we are at 20,000 feet, so I insert the direct to the point which is behind us, and execute. Let's see what happens in terms of bank angle, sorry. You see that we're going to 30 degrees bank, so it's a higher bank angle, given the fact that we have good protection from the stall at this altitude. For the rest, the lateral navigation is not anything particular than what will be the Vorlog, so the autopilot is doing nothing else than correcting this distance from the green line. So you see that we have 0.5 right now, meaning that the autopilot should turn to the left, because we find ourselves to the right. So all the autopilot will be doing is turning left and right in order to reduce this error and bring it back to zero. Now actually we're turning with 30 degrees bank, so we cannot turn with more than that, and that's why we're building up this little error. I could reset it by giving it again the direct, by the way. No, I can't give it direct. Why? Okay. And there we go, with again the direct to VIB. So yeah, I was saying the what the autopilot is doing is keeping that 0-1 right. All the autopilot does is steering the aircraft left and right in order to keep this distance from the green light to 0. That's exactly the same function at the end of the day of the Vorlog. The only difference is that the Vorlog was keeping the CDI centered at 0, while this function is keeping the distance centered at 0. And if the green light is turning, then in order to keep the distance 0, the aircraft has to turn as well. But apart from this little difference, the logic of functioning is exactly the same logic of navigation.
Paolo's Pilot Lounge. Like and subscribe now.
This brings us to the conclusion of video number 2 concerning the lateral navigation. We have seen that at the end there's not much to talk about except keeping constant back angle, keeping an heading, or keeping a lateral navigation that will be either centering the HSI or following the magenta or the green line of the FMS. it's not going to be that simple when we talk about the vertical navigation. We're gonna have to add on some parameters on the slave loops. Once again, thank you for your like and subscribe. Thank you for sharing this video with your friends, and I will see you soon.
Oh, finally my coffee. Short Italian coffee, that's how coffee should be. You know, English coffee should be.